As we've seen in the pictures of many photographers, the environment plays a role in the messaging. Now, in many stories, the environment is as strong an element as any one of the characters. You may recognize some of these scenes from television and film. All of these stories would have been very different if they'd taken place anywhere than where they were actually filmed. This week, I'm asking you to photograph the environments that you have at your disposal. You'll need to create photos of 6 different areas. Now, these will be the locations where you'll be staging your storytelling photos for a future assignment. There are certainly some rooms in your house, maybe a deck or a porch, a garage, a backyard, a workshop, perhaps an interesting view of a tree or fencing. If you feel animals are an important visual element in these locations, include them. Certainly use models if you want, so you can see how you're going to stage the shots. But I think you'll find indoor locations to be best because you can control the lighting in these areas. You know, our goal is to build a profile of each space that showcases how we can use those areas for storytelling. Perhaps there's a cluttered workbench in your father's shed that doesn't seem clean or in the least bit organized enough to use as an environment. But if all the lights were out and there was a single overhead lamp lighting just a certain portion of the bench, it could be a perfect place to build bombs or invent a new device to help amputees walk upstairs. Maybe your kitchen looks boring under the existing electric lights, but late in the day maybe there's some rays of golden light streaming in through the window. There's always a way to make these environments look more dramatic. If there isn't compelling natural lighting, you'll need to make your own lighting. You could make your normally boring kitchen a perfect place to stage a story about a famous chef, or a man that's just lost his wife, or maybe a young girl that has invited a guy she likes for dinner. When you think about the scenes you've seen in your favorite movies, try to envision the environments that they were shot in. You probably don't remember these environments unless they had telling details. Now, a telling detail is often a clue in the story that comes into play later. In movies, the camera may linger on a partially open door, or a footprint, or a cigarette butt with a trace of red lipstick. In still photography, we see telling details in advertising all the time. You just open up any magazine and look at the ads. There are messaging elements in every big dollar advertisement. If the target audience is retirement-aged folks, the visual messaging will link the product with security, peacefulness, or relaxation. This is such an old strategy, we don't even get bothered by these moves, even when they're really overt. In that way, advertising specialists have really worn us down completely. In the high dollar shots, there's always a second level of communication. Now, it will be your job to leave some clues in your environmental photos. Explore what emotion you want to trigger by placing a telling detail here or there. Now, be creative. Think it through. How do you intend these environments to be used? What characters will inhabit these spaces? You'll be shooting a picture story in future assignments, so do some advanced planning. You're the location scout now. Watch how the lighting changes through the day and the night to envision what could happen there. Introduce lighting whenever you think it will influence the viewer's emotion. A dark room with a light focused on an empty chair could be an invitation or a clue to impending doom. Depending on the angle of the view, the accessories, how sharp the lighting is, how big the spot of light is. What if the chair had some knitting stuff on it? What if the chair had a plate with half-eaten food and a bottle nearby? What if the chair had an old hat, a wig, maybe a pair of overalls or jeans. Now, many of you have no experience with controlled lighting. The subject of lighting it's a lifetime task, and nobody learns everything. There is always something new to know about it. Many of you will assume that you need powerful and expensive lights to create the kind of mood required for a picture story. But that is certainly true for a feature film. But still photographers have a big advantage over motion picture photographers. We can alter our exposure, gather enough light to create an image with our desired brightness, and just add light where we need it to create drama. Movie and video cameras can shoot as slow as a 30th of a second before images start to get very blurry. But we can have a 30-second exposure. If the camera and scene remain still, we'll still have a sharp result. In the case of low light situations, and those are often the most dramatic, you will need a good tripod. If you're shooting outdoors, highlight an area to achieve your desired mood. Put a model into the scene whenever you want to see how the light plays out. It's okay to have models in any of the scenes for this assignment. Now, there are some very clever ways to achieve a mood by just using available light. And when I say available light, I'm not saying light as you happen to find it, like a room with an overhead light on. That's likely to be too boring for our purposes. I'm going to include the use of additional lights, but not necessarily studio lamps, to make the mood that I want. The term for these lights are practicals. Now, a practical light adds brightness to an area where it's needed. Practicals often appear in the scene, and that makes them look quite natural. Perhaps it's a lamp that lights up a dark corner of a room, or a reading light that illuminates a person doing a task. Some practicals, and these are my favorite, are not soft lighting fixtures like this light over my table. They are floor lamps or reading lamps that send out a strong beam of light that can be quite concentrated where you need it most. An iPad, cell phone, or a laptop can be great practicals because they can be placed very close to your subject's face and turned so they don't shine into the camera. That's critical when you use a practical, that it doesn't shine into the camera. In the use of an iPad, it's perfectly fine to have it in the hands of the model. If your story includes a character getting a text or an email, how else would you show it? How would you show your character reading a text? That shot is the perfect setup to showing the actual message on the screen, which would be the shot that occurs after your subject is reading something. You know, when practicals provide the main light in the scene, they're called key practicals. They become the main source of dramatic light and shadow. Let me repeat that. A practical becomes your key light when it's the main source for the dramatic light and shadow in the scene. Now comes the most important point of using a key light, and it applies to practicals. When you have your subject lit by a key light that is brighter than all the rest of the lights in the environment, you have to reduce the exposure to maintain detail in the highlights. And when you reduce the exposure by closing down the aperture, speeding up the shutter, or lowering the ISO, or any combination of those, everything else besides the highlights on the subject that you're lighting becomes darker. The entire environment becomes darker when you expose for the highlights. And that's where the magic happens. So in summary, a bright key light allows you to darken the scene and still keep a good exposure on your subject. When you choose a location and add lighting, expose for the bright areas and let the dark areas go dark. How do you do that? Well, certainly not in the auto mode. That will never work. I recommend using the manual mode so you can control the exposure to your taste by shooting a photo, reviewing it on the LCD, and making adjustments. Begin with the exposure indicator in the center position and examine your result. It's very likely that your highlight area will be too bright. It'll be burned out. Now, let in less light by speeding up the shutter or choosing a smaller aperture. Maybe you're going to go from f8 to f11. That's half the amount of light. f11 to f16. Again, halving the light. So it will give you the effect you want. If you have no experience with the manual mode, please watch a link to a lesson from the beginning class to fill you in on the concept. I'll send that out in your assignment. Now, if you become confused or frustrated because you cannot get a proper exposure, there's one fallback position. Now, I hesitate to bring this up, but many of you haven't taken the beginning class and your understanding of exposure is probably pretty limited. Here it is. You can use your cell phone for this assignment. Modern cell phones do a great job in difficult lighting situations, especially if you turn on the HDR feature. That's high dynamic range. So let's review the elements and requirements of this environment assignment. There are 6 photos required. You can have models in the scene, but are not required to do so. You are encouraged to alter the lighting to make the scenes more dramatic. You'll be using some of these scenes in future assignments, so pick your locations with that in mind. Don't choose a location that you won't have access to when you need it. Of course, you can use locations that you don't show in this assignment for future assignments, but for right now, you are the location scout for this upcoming production. I look forward to seeing your work.